Oops. What have I done here? All right, there we go. Yes. Thanks, as Bruce said, for coming on a not a particularly fun day to be out and about, but hopefully make it worth your while. And thanks to the festival for inviting me along to talk to you this afternoon about my new book, The Patch. I will sort of give a thematic overview, I guess, of the book, and then we'll move on to a Q&A. And what I mean by thematic, I'm not going to... The book is actually quite sort of street level in its journalism. It's told primarily through a handful of characters, both people who work in the industry, live in Fort McMurray, and opponents of the industry as well. And really, I tried to put my own arguments aside and let the actors in the drama kind of tell the story of the patch. Now, what is the patch? What is this thing I'm talking about? It is an enormous industrial project in the boreal forest of northern Alberta, aka the oil sands. Oil sands refers to the resource itself. Also an extraordinarily divisive topic in Canada's ongoing national debate about climate change and our energy future, right down to the point where, you know, the terminology we choose stakes out a camp in some conversations. If I'm saying oil sands, and that places me on the other side of the fence from people who insist on calling them tar sands. There's a number of books at the back that do exactly that. That was not an arbitrary choice on my part. I went with what I felt was the more common and somewhat less charged term. The backstory of the oil sands is a fascinating one, dating right back into the late 1800s. We've been trying to turn this stuff into something, a commodity someone would pay for somewhere around a century, and along the way, the terms oil sands and tar sands have been used interchangeably. As you'll see, the very first company to ever commercially mine the resource at any scale was called Great Canadian Oil Sands. That the term was not created recently as a PR move. Very early on, one of the first research scientists to ever take significant samples, he used the term bituminous sands, which is a bit of a mouthful. In French, it's sable bitumineux. But we, anyway, have settled mainly on oil sands as our preferred term. I think the fact that maybe sets you in a camp says a lot about just how extraordinarily charged the debate around this resource, this 2.5 million barrels of oil a day being produced out of northern Alberta, really has become. And so that really, I think, gets to why this book and why it was a project I wanted to take on. Here's a topic of constant public debate in this country, extraordinarily strong opinions, pro and con, and yet we don't actually know that much about it and how it came to be. The full story of the oil sands, both how it came to be this enormous enterprise and also how it came to be so controversial, divisive, such a flashpoint, not just in Canada, but worldwide for the global climate change debate, not terribly well told. And so that's really what I've tried to do in the patch. And in thinking about, you know, what is the sort of core of the story? The core of the story, I think, you know, I had some ideas going in, but as I was finishing the book, I ran into a quote by a colleague of mine, Misha Glauberman. And Misha teaches negotiation strategies, and Misha, you know, says the sort of core of his work is, you know, to teach people why empathy is so important when you're negotiating. He says if you're in a negotiation, it's almost invariably in your interest to understand the other person's point of view, and I think that's gets at the heart of what I've been trying to do with this book. Is wherever you come to you know, if you're in a camp on the subject or not yet sure which side, maybe to give you some sense of what that other point of view is and how it came to take its position on the oil sands. So what is the nature of this conflict we're negotiating in northern Alberta and, you know, by proxy for our climate policy nationwide? And one way it's often framed is that we're talking about short-term economic gain versus long-term economic health, profits now versus a more stable climate later. And I actually don't think even that sets the frame wide enough. The way I describe it in the book is that really what we're doing here in Canada and to some degree around the world, when we talk about the oil sands, is we are debating and negotiating the definition of progress in a modern democratic society. We are fundamentally arguing over what it means to do well and to do good in a country like Canada. And that is not a small or easy matter. That is going to be a long, protracted, multi-stage debate that already has a couple chapters in it before we come to any kind of final agreement on what to do about it or any other piece of our carbon footprint. To date, it has not been, to my mind, a particularly constructive negotiation. This is the sort of backdrop against which I'm writing the book, which is two very firmly entrenched camps. As I said off the top, barely agree on the terminology that we are going to use to have the debate. And on some level, this is understandable because the stakes are, in fact, so high. And I don't want to in any way diminish that. As I write in the book, the 21st century will be defined by how civilization reconciles its powerful hunger for energy with the toll taken on the planet's basic equilibrium. And the trial run in that long negotiation, which is a thing that's going to occur around the world for many years to come, is underway today in the patch for a whole bunch of reasons, some of which I'll address now and others of which I address in the book. The patch became not just a Canadian debate, certainly not just a regional Canadian debate, but really a global proxy battle in this much larger conversation that we are having about what to do about climate change. And I think that aspect of it shouldn't be diminished either. A lot of the degree of rancor and polarization around the debate has a significant measure to do with the fact that it became such a broad conversation about what basically what our energy future is supposed to look like. So when I say competing definitions of progress, what do I mean? Well, the oil sands is a direct product of one of those definitions of progress, which I identify in the book as the high modern definition. Everyone knows modernity, the modern age. The high modern period is usually thought of as beginning around the end of World War II, and this is basically that secular faith in the limitless ability of new technology, large-scale industry, and careful government planning to invent a wondrously prosperous future. That sort of post-World War II faith in technology, better living through chemistry, bigger and better and grander ambitions, a lot of it driven by the energy bounty of fossil fuels, particularly oil, which truly came into its own. As we came out of World War II, we reformed every city in this country around the dimensions that oil could bring in terms of mobility. We rethought the sort of basic tenets of what a good life looked like around this high modern idea of progress, which was very much dependent on cheap, abundant energy and the ability to harness it readily at the scale, from the scale of an automobile on up. So that is, that's that first definition which kind of governed the 20th century. There was emerging alongside it, although it was not recognized at the time, a competing definition of progress. And this began as a critique of the excesses of the existing definition of progress, basically, beginning with the early days of the environmental movement, essentially saying, for all of its glories, this high modern order has begun to take a toll on the planet that is unacceptable. And we need to rein in its excesses. We need to regulate it, figure out ways to basically bring the planet's health into the equation. Over the years, this became less a critique of the excesses of the system and more of a direct challenge to it at a fundamental level. And in particular, with the emergence of climate change, where we recognized that we were changing the planet's atmosphere and the planet's climate at a geologic scale. This was this competing definition of progress, which in the 21st century we've come to think of as the Anthropocene definition of progress. The Anthropocene is the working term for this new geologic age we live in, defined by the human footprint. And this is actually not just a rhetorical flourish, although that's how it began. There are now the scientists who study geologic time and give it names and give it dates. are studying and probably will eventually officially designate the Anthropocene epoch as an epoch that emerged around the start of the industrial age, where we began altering the planet at geologic scale. We'll come back to that one, but let's talk about the high modern and where the high modern came from. This is, as I said, this is that faith in technological progress that defined a lot of the 20th century. Cars and drive-ins, shopping malls, air travel, all of this stuff that could suddenly be done, began as miraculous things and then became commonplace. And a lot of it driven by oil. And it was out of this hunt for more and more energy to drive this expansion of the industrial economies that the oil sands first emerged as a serious concern. What you're looking at here is the launch of the first major oil sands mine, the Great Canadian Oil Sands Mine, that began operating in 1967. And one thing I'd ask you to note, as I describe in the book, this is just a classic scene of high modern theater. It's got sort of a little bit of almost a Citizen Kane vibe to it. This idea of these great men up on the podium announcing. Like if you look at the slogan over the logo there, man develops his world. And this was an unassailable truth as far as anyone in the room was concerned. This was the purpose of industrial society and an open democracy, was to develop the world, to find things that had value, turn them into energy and money, and expand the economy to the point where that's still the basic benchmark we use for the health of an economy. Is it growing, and at what rate? That can certainly be disputed, but that is, certainly in the 20th century, as the oil sands emerged as a major resource, this was understood to be an absolute good by just about everyone engaged in that work at the time. It did not happen overnight. It did not happen 10 years ago when oil hit $100 a barrel. It had been, even by 1967, it had been 3/4 of a century of playing around with this very, very difficult sludgy resource that we knew was resident in extraordinary amounts under the boreal forest in northern Alberta. In the top photo, you're looking at an experimental paving project in Edmonton in 1915, conducted by Sidney Ells of the Bureau of Mines on behalf of the federal government. Sidney Ells was the first research scientist to take large deposits of bitumen and attempt to turn them into useful stuff. It worked fine as asphalt. It just wasn't a particularly cheap way to make it. That would be a problem that vexed the oil sands for nearly a century. It worked. It was oil. You could do all the things you could do with any other kind of oil, but it was really, really expensive to turn into the products that you wanted to turn it into. Ells, a gentleman named Carl Clark, on behalf of the provincial government, and a handful of entrepreneurs over the ensuing half century made various attempts to turn oil sands into something useful. I mention all this. The backstory is fantastic and colorful and massively underrepresented in our understanding of the history of it, and that's a whole separate topic. But I mention it here mainly to point out we did not decide recently that this was something worth investing in. This is something that we spent decades and decades trying to figure out. The second oil sands mine, the Syncrude mine, opened in 1978. It is best understood at its conception as a kind of ersatz crown corporation, not a private enterprise. Syncrude had 3 oil companies involved in it, but it also had 3 governments. The federal government, the Alberta government, and the Ontario government were all multi-million-dollar investors in that second oil sands plant, and all levels of government remained enormously supportive of trying to get the resource to market at a profitable rate, which they finally began to do at the moment you see in the bottom photo there, where Jean Chrétien and Ralph Klein and a number of other cabinet ministers all gathered in Fort McMurray in 1995 to announce the Declaration of Opportunity. They had introduced new tax and royalty schemes which made financing an oil sands project much more affordable. At the time, this was in 95, they were promising that $25 billion would be invested over the next 25 years, that we were making this public investment of a sort into this resource so that in 25 years we would see $25 billion in private investment to triple the production from 400,000 barrels to 4 million barrels. As it turned out, these were erroneous numbers. It took all of 8 years to hit the $25 billion investment mark. The oil sands cleared 1.2 million barrels around 2008, and now closer to 3 million barrels of oil produced every day. Basically, by every single measure extant at the time, it has been a wild, runaway, high modern industrial success. Beyond the wildest dreams even of Eric Newell of Syncrude, who made the pitch to the governments, this is what we need to do, this is how we need to redesign the way we finance and tax these things so that we can get money in. By the peak of the boom, which I describe in some detail in the book, investment was coming into the oil sands at more than $20 billion a year. Again, far beyond what anyone thought back in '95 was possible. What's more, an enormous amount of the resource, which had previously not been available when all of this was first conceived, the deep bitumen, the mining is basically for the stuff right at the surface. The vast majority of the oil sands resource sits in situ, as they say, and in situ bitumen had been a difficult, seemingly intractable problem for decades and decades, until the Alberta government set up a Crown corporation, or Crown research body, with the exclusive goal of turning in situ bitumen into usable oil. And this was an organization called AOSTRA. AOSTRA spent a quarter century and millions of public dollars in partnership with many other governments and private sector actors to develop a technology called steam-assisted gravity drainage. That's what you're looking at here. SAGD is basically the way we get now the majority of the oil out of the oil sands. What it is it's a pair of conventional oil wells of a sort that go straight down and then usually horizontally into a seam of bitumen. The top one of the pair is injected with high pressure, high temperature steam, which liquefies the oil in the seam and then drips it down into the perforated bottom well where it's pumped to the surface. SAGD was, right up to the sort of moment that that the oil sands began to boom extraordinarily around 2003, 2004, seen as kind of a technological miracle. In a sense, kind of the exclamation point on the whole high modern project. Not only had we made it profitable, not only was it booming, but we had figured out how to unlock the whole resource. Again, just to reiterate that point, this was seen as a net positive, if not a complete positive, by just about all involved right up to that point. Critiques had begun to emerge, and we'll come back to those, but I kind of emphasize that because I think there's a tendency, given how rancorous the debate has become, to suggest that there had always been this sense of caution at the recklessness at which we were going at this thing, and that's simply not the case. The liberal governments of the mid to late 1990s, for example, were very proud of the progress they made in bringing this stuff to market. And so they did, and then with oil prices skyrocketing beyond anyone's reckoning into the first years of the millennium, the thing boomed like crazy. Maybe the greatest resource boom in Canadian history, certainly one of the wildest in terms of pace and scale, to the point now where, even with oil quite cheap, the scene every morning on Highway 63 north out of Fort McMurray to the main oil sands sites is an extraordinary clockwork enterprise at amazing scale. What you're looking at here is one piece of it that I found particularly fascinating, which is that there is this vast private bus system that, if it were a public transit system, it would be the envy of a city 5 times Fort McMurray's size. Dozens and dozens and dozens of these diversified luxury coaches picking up oil sands workers and taking them to their jobs and back again. It operates just like a public transit system, right down to the point of using public transit stops to some degree, but is way more efficient and way more extensive in its network than a city of 80,000 usually has. And that's attests to the scale at which the place boomed and the resource was unlocked. The face of the industry as it boomed through these years, the way it was often described was, it made it sound like kind of a glorified work camp combined with a Klondike gold rush kind of mentality. The everyday reality of Fort McMurray, and this is something I take some pains to explain in the book, is very different from that. It's a very quiet little industry town with a workaholics kind of vibe to it. There's a blogger who I was reading at one point when I was doing some background research, and he had a blog post where he said, it's more Cypress Creek than Dawson City to live in Fort McMurray. Dawson City, you all know, is the heart of the Klondike. Cypress Creek was the model company town that Homer Simpson relocated to in an episode of The Simpsons in order to work for an evil mastermind named Hank Scorpio. What the blogger was getting at was that the typical scene for the vast majority of Fort McMurray's residents is not that wild downtown strip of casinos and strip malls and a handful of rowdy bars, but in fact this very quiet, comfortable, quite enviable to some degree, suburban scene where more than 2/3 of the residents of Fort McMurray live. And from the point of view of that high modern definition of progress, where suburbia was kind of its ultimate residential expression, Fort McMurray has done a very good job of building a very good version of that. The people who have come there from all over the world, across Canada, find an enviable quality of life, not counting the weather and the fact that it's a fairly expensive place to live. It's a place where a lot of people spend a lot of time outdoors, both at work and at play. It's a place where people have the money to own multiple recreational vehicles and drag them out into the boreal forest and rip around on them for their holidays, that sort of thing. More than that, though, it's a remarkably diverse city. The most interesting thing I found about Fort McMurray is you think of the urban experiment that's gone on across Canada over the last 50 years, where we've transformed our cities into these extraordinarily diverse immigrant-built communities welcoming people from around the globe. What happened in half a century in most cities in Canada happened in 10 years in Fort McMurray. Because it was such a magnet for job seekers, for immigrants, it conducted the whole experiment to the point where it has its own cricket club, for example. That's the photo at the top. I spent some time with one of the cricket teams. One of the main characters in the book is a bus driver for that vast private bus service named Raheel Joseph, who also is the star of his cricket team. He's fairly typical, I think, in that he came to Canada without a clear sense of what he was going to do, except that there were more opportunities here than in Pakistan. He began his immigrant journey working in his sister's hair salon in suburban Toronto, which he found to be a very strange job for a Pakistani man. And around 2007, at the height of the boom, a friend of his who was living elsewhere in Canada said, "We're heading to Fort McMurray. We hear that there's good jobs there. My uncle works in security. He says he can get us on." And really, the most welcome path for an immigrant like Raheel was to go to Fort McMurray, get training, eventually get on as a diversified bus driver and build a family and a home there. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we talk about the future of it. Wherever we go next, that's who's there. That's the sort of people who are there. In the bottom photo, kind of another testament to that as well. Fort McMurray, among other things, has one of the most interesting Muslim communities maybe anywhere on earth, in that they all pray together. There is no division between Sunni and Shia and Ismaili. The Fort McMurray Mosque has a prayer hall built for 200, and there are 2,500 Muslims who show up to pray during Ramadan. That's what you're looking at in the bottom photo is the faithful coming to prayer on Friday in Ramadan at a junior high school where they've rented out the gymnasium to have enough room to pray. Just another little slice of the scale at which Fort McMurray is growing, and the way in which, in some ways, it really is a mirror of the country at its sort of highest ideal. People coming from all over the world together to do something, build a life and a family and the rest of it. That is not the main way we talk about Fort McMurray is testimony to the strength of the competing definition of progress. And I could place the beginning of that other conversation a lot of places, but where we really began, both in this country and beyond, to think about Fort McMurray that way was when 1,600 ducks, after a spring snowstorm, landed on a tailings pond at a Syncrude site and splashed across the world's newspapers with these horrifying images of ducks struggling to break free. The interesting thing about it, not to go too far into it, I think these images resonated in part, one, because they reminded us of images of the Exxon Valdez disaster and other sorts of vast ecological disasters. This really was not an incident of that scale. Not to belittle it, but 1,600 birds dying in a province where 300,000 are killed by hunters every year was not a major ecological incident. It was, however, a giant PR disaster, and it really began to change the conversation about what Fort McMurray was and what the place of the patch was in our national story. And I think did so in part because the industry itself did not understand where that other conversation had come from. They viewed this as a sort of minor shrug of a disaster. We'll pay the fine, we'll carry on. The environmentalists will get mad, but they get mad about everything, and what do we care? And this is what they were thinking of, presumably, was that you know, we've seen these other little, you know, an industry comes in for a certain amount of criticism, a few things change, and we carry on. And this really is where that Anthropocene tradition began, and in particular in Canada, where, you know, around the time the oil sands was getting up to speed, we were becoming, I think in our national image, and in truth on the ground, a major player in the global environmental scene. We saw ourselves as excellent stewards of our vast wilderness, and so on and so forth, whether it's, you know, David Suzuki in the Haida Gwaii, the Haida stopping logging in Haida Gwaii, to Brian Mulroney badgering George Bush Sr. into signing an acid rain treaty, to Canadian scientists and bureaucrats leading a global ban on ozone-depleting chemicals that would eventually be named for Montreal. This was, you know, a side of Canada that a lot of us embraced. And then that expanded as climate change became a major piece of the puzzle. And this was the piece of it that I talk about in the book where the conversation kind of left the Canadian stage and moved onto a much larger one, which kind of makes sense when you think about it, because the entire climate change problem is a global problem, and there are global organizations working to solve it. But it was interesting and for very specific reasons that Alberta's oil sands became the sort of poster child for this problem that is global in scale and is caused not by 2 million barrels a day coming out of northern Alberta, but by 90-some million barrels a day being burned worldwide every day. What probably the most significant proximate cause of the shift in the conversation was the collapse of the global climate talks in Copenhagen in 2009. For climate activists around the world, this was considered a giant setback, but particularly American activists who had felt with Barack Obama in office that they were finally going to see some real action on climate change. Didn't happen in 2009. The cap and trade bill that was the centerpiece of Obama's climate legislation collapsed soon after, and American climate activists were quite bereft and lost and looking for another way to talk about climate change, and settled on a particular argument about the oil sands, an argument that emerged from James Hansen, the NASA scientist who sounded the alarm first in Congress about the climate threat in the late 1980s, and then got echoed through prominent environmental activists like Bill McKibben and his 350.org network. And this was based on a paper that James Hansen published initially just for his colleagues, warning about the amount of carbon dioxide that would be released if the oil sands continued to expand the way it was, particularly if the Keystone XL pipeline got approved. Keystone was a very good target for activists in that it was a discrete project. You only needed one person's opinion to change, that was the president's, and you could kill it forever potentially. And it made not just climate activists, but ranchers and First Nations activists and a whole bunch of other people mad. And the target was outside the United States with no vested interests in the American economy or American government. And even more conveniently, the thing looked like a poster child for Armageddon. It didn't, you know, it was very easy to translate images of oil sands mines to the idea that there was this carbon bomb, as Bill McKibben put it, a 1,500-mile fuse to the biggest carbon bomb on the continent, that the entire planet would be doomed should that pipeline be approved. This is, incidentally, by no means supported by the data behind what Keystone XL can and will do if it's ever built. Hansen's original carbon math was that 200 parts per million of CO2 would be added to the Earth's atmosphere if all of the resource was exploited. That's enormous because the entire global warming to date since the dawn of the industrial age is less than 200 parts per million, but it would require burning 1.4 trillion barrels, 1.4 trillion barrels of bitumen, which Andrew Leach at the University of Alberta calculated would take 1,300 years if the industry grew threefold from its current size. It was not actually a reasonable way of talking about it. And in fact, Andrew Weaver, who many of you now know as the first Green cabinet minister in Canadian provincial political history, when he was still a climate scientist, kind of took a look at the carbon math in 2012, just looking at the 166 billion barrels of proven resource that the industry ever expected to possibly exploit, and found that if all of it were burned, which would still take a century or more, could add 2/100ths of a degree to global warming. We wanted to address the carbon bomb question, Weaver said when his study came out, and frankly, these numbers aren't as big as I thought they could be. They would be, sorry. By this point, though, the fine details didn't matter. Everywhere you went where there was climate protests, the tar sands were the #1 target. In these two photos here are two scenes that I describe in more detail in the book of regional protests on regional issues. One of them is in South Portland, Maine, where activists were blocking the arrival of bitumen through basically a pipeline that already went to the port was going to start carrying bitumen, and that became a flashpoint for activism. And then also these protests against the megaloads, these huge modules that are built in Asia and then shipped up to northern Alberta to help build oil sands facilities. By this point, the symbol had become the goal. We were not talking about the oil sands or the Keystone XL pipeline as a symbol of the larger problem so much as the first necessary step in stopping the problem. This isn't supported by climate evidence or climate change evidence. There's no question the oil sands are, it's the biggest, fastest growing part of Canada's carbon footprint. They are dirtier barrels of oil by any reasonable measure, but not significantly enough so that the climate change problem as currently construed couldn't be solved with them still a part of it. That's a whole separate thing that we can talk about later if you want. In any case, it has brought to light the essential paradox that's kind of at the center of Canada's founding, at least as a European nation, which is on the one hand that we are a resource extracting nation, always have been. In some sense, the purpose of the country has always been to find resources, exploit them, make money, and build out the country still further, to the point where you can still, this goes all the way back, of course, to the fur trade and the rest of it. You can still go to places like Fort Chipewyan downstream from the oil sands sites today and find very small vestige of that fur trade economy still existing. That's that one tradition. That's the one that became the high modern one that the oil sands tapped into. And then on the other hand, we have this sense of ourselves as economic stewards with every intention of meeting our Paris climate goals and intending to be not just part of the global movement, but a leader in it. And these two things are not going to be easily resolved. And there will be extraordinary pressure for years to come in both of those and many other directions, both to stop particular projects like oil sands pipelines and to continue to expand them in order to keep the economy growing. A couple of lines from characters in the book to frame that debate. The first one comes to us from Jim Gray, who's sort of a legend of the Alberta oil patch, speaking specifically of the increasing competition around oil and the pressure from the need for climate action, said, we need to have an urgent level of research and innovation and technology. We have to recognize that we are in a fight for our life up here. Jim's point there is, if you can get the footprint of a barrel of oil sands bitumen down at or below that of a conventional barrel of oil, then you can continue to make a case for it. You need to do that while also making it as affordable as fracked oil out of places like the Bakken Shale not far from here. Incidentally, that is one of those things that tends to come up in conversation with people in the oil sands industry when they sort of say, as our mayor does in Calgary, why these particular barrels? Why is that one pipeline carrying all the carbon sins of the world? While we've been debating the Keystone XL pipeline for 5 years now, 6, the United States added more than 4 million barrels of fracked oil to its daily budget. Equally problematic from a climate and local environmental point of view, but nowhere near the flashpoint that the oil sands became. So that's one side of it. The other side comes to us from Robert Granjam. He's a trapper and hunter and fisherman in Fort Chipewyan, who says there's no better time to be the example and stand above and say, no, I don't need oil and gas to feed my family or have a brand new truck. That's a fairly common sentiment in places like Fort Chipewyan, but it's got extra resonance, I think, coming from Robert, because until very recently, he had spent most of his adult life working as a millwright most of the year on an oil sands site, and had fought very hard to get that job, had done very well while continuing a couple months of the year to maintain trap lines and fish nets and the rest of it in Fort Chip. He would come and tend his traditional nets and the rest of it, and then drive on back to Fort McMurray and work in the mines. That dichotomy, that sort of having it both ways, if you will, is something fairly common in the industry, and I think gets to the kind of crux of the problem. In any case, that's the kind of broad thematic overview. The book, as I said, goes into a lot more detail on basically letting these characters tell their story of how they came to do the work they do and how they feel about it. My intention there basically was, rather than for me to make an argument about it, to let the actors in the drama have that argument on the page, and you as the reader hopefully come to your own conclusions about which you think is the more compelling case. The one thing I would say is I don't think it's something we're going to solve really soon. I think we're going to be stuck in this paradox for a long time to come. And my hope with the book is that at the very least we can come to a bit more agreement on the basic facts of the case as we move forward with that debate. So with that, I think I have a few minutes to open it up for questions, comments, corrections, whatever you've got in mind.
Does your community group or organization have an educational session, lecture, or workshop that you would like to have on Winnipeg Talks? Send us an email at createtv@sean.ca. Give us a call at 204-480-3500, or find us online at Sean TV, Winnipeg.